Greece is one of the most well-known countries of all time, and even more so, their ancient history is well-known to most on a broad level. However, I'm not going too deep on ancient Greece, but more so the overall history of the Greek state. Archaeological remains show that Greece has had a long prehistory, dating from the Neolithic 4000 BC with the Bronze Age of 2800 BC. Important cultures developed. In fact, the Aegean civilization had several phases. Two of the most important being the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization. I definitely mispronounced one of those. These cultures disappeared in 1100 BC, while the Greek-speaking Achaeans migrated into the Peloponnese during the 14th and 13th century BC. The Aeolians and the Ionians apparently preceded the Dorians, who migrated into Greece before 1000 BC. The Ionians moving back perhaps as refugees or as conquerors, settled in the Ionian Islands and the coast of Asia Minor, which became part of the Greek world. After the Doric invasion, the peoples of Greece, under the influence of geographical division and in relation to the great variety of tribes, developed a city-state, small settlements, and that grew into minor kingdoms. Just a warning, this video there will be a lot of just words of the various Greek tribes or just tribes that deal with the history of Greece. And there's just a lot of them. And I'm not going to go too deep into pretty much any of them because there's just that many. But Homeric Greece, named after the great poet Homer, was based on agriculture in areas relatively unproductive, but it was already open to the sea. Although the Greeks did not rival as sailors with the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and Romans, the sea offered them an opportunity for expansion and trade. In the 8th through the 6th century BC, the Greeks founded important colonies, many of which became autonomous city-states, starting from the Black Sea and the Bosphorus, up in Sicily, southern Italy, Mediterranean France, the northern coast of Africa, and Spain. These colonies had a great influence on the history of the Greek mainland, where the city-states were fighting for liberation. Because of their independence, the cities developed separately. However, there was a general pattern of development with the necessary changes. Monarchies transferred to aristocracies, which were in turn replaced by tyrants, who usually gained power in espousing the cause of the underprivileged and by using force. Although the tyrants usually tried to establish dynasties, Greek tyranny on the continent will soon have given way to democracies, oligarchies, or limited by the lowest citizenship and of slavery. It was in Greece that the idea of political democracy was light. The conflicts of the city-state had a sense of unity. All their citizens considered themselves Hellenes, and religious unity gave rise to alloys. However, the Ionian cities of Asia Minor received little help from Greece when they revolted in 499 BC against Persia, which also threatened the Greek mainland. While mainland cities were poorly united in the Persian Wars that continued until 449 BC, successes in these wars, however, was the powerful impulse of Greek civilization. Athens, in particular, with the support of the Delian League, as the basis of the empire, grew dramatically, and the time of Pericles, 495 through 429 BC, developed a culture that would have left their mark in the Western and Eastern civilizations. Drama, poetry, sculpture, architecture, and philosophy flourished along with the vigorous intellectual life. The leader of the Greeks in 4th-5th century BC, including Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Phidias, Myron, Polykleitos, Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates. Even if Athens succumbed in the Peloponnesian War and Sparta triumphed briefly before continued fighting gave the hegemony over Greece to Corinth and the Thebes. The civilization that created continued to live when Philip II of Macedon attacked the warring city-states and conquered Greece by defeating the Athenians and the Thebans in the Battle of Chaeronea. His son Alexander the Great would soon spread Greek civilization in the Western world, Asia and India. After Alexander's death, his empire was torn by his generals in the ongoing conflict in the period 323 to 276 BC. Some Greek cities formed the League Aetolians to oppose Macedonian rule, but some members of the Achaean League took sides with the Macedonians. The Greek city-states continued their rivalries, and Macedonia became completely Hellenized. The continuing war in Greece made it increasingly weak, while Rome grew stronger. In 146 BC, after the Fourth Macedonian War, The remains of the Greek states fell definitively into the hands of Rome. Under Roman rule, cities have long maintained a certain independence and fervent intellectual life, but little political or economic importance. The Hellenism, however, had triumphed, and Greek intellectual supremacy continued for many centuries. The Byzantine Empire was full of Greek origin and Hellenistic civilization centered at Alexandria, Pergamum, Dura, and other cities spread Greek influence and preserved the heritage Greek in later centuries. The Greeks were the first to write narrative secular history, and the works of Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Polybius were the sources of events and contemporary ideas, as well as the classics of world literature. From the division 395 AD, the Roman Empire in the east and west, until the conquest of Greece by the Ottoman Turks, Greece shared the fortunes and vicissitudes of the Byzantine Empire. The victory of the emperor marked the beginning of the frequent and devastating barbarian invasions of Greece, followed by the Huns, Avars, Slavs, and Bulgarians. The power and prestige of Greece has been restored by the Macedonian dynasty of Byzantine emperors, but the center of the Greek world was Constantinople, not Greece proper. In the 11th century, the Turks began to take hold in the empire. The Normans attacked Epirus and began the Crusades. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 led to the temporary disintegration of the Byzantine Empire and the creation of a feudal state under the rule of the noble French, Flemish, and Venetian. The restored Byzantine Empire recovered only parts of Greece, most of which continued under the rule of French and Italian princes until conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Genoa Chios held until 1566. Venice retained Crete until 1669 and the Ionian Islands until 1797. In its many wars with the Ottomans, Venice also held for short periods Athens, Euboea, and several other ports and islands until 1718. Under the Ottoman Empire, Greece was merely one of the many territories to exploit. The Turks practiced religious tolerance, but otherwise the regime was harsh and oppressive. Many Greek families were fundamental cornerstones of the administration of the empire. The Greek merchants living in Constantinople and the ports of Asia Minor, notably Izmir, were very rich, but Greece languished in obscurity and poverty. In the early 19th century, the desire for independence of the Greeks was stimulated by growing nationalism, the influence of the French Revolution in favor of the Turks in the Russo-Turkish War, rebellion of Ali Pasha against the Ottoman Empire, whose foreign minister was Greek. In 1821, the Greek War of Independence began. The European sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the Greek cause, and many were dished out financial aid. Many foreign volunteers joined the Greek forces. Russia and Britain decided by a composition to mediate conflicts between the Greeks and Turkey, and in 1827, the Greek political factions put aside their rivalries to elect a president of Greece. Great Britain, Russia, and France joined in demanding an armistice. Turkey refused, and the Allied fleets attacked and defeated the fleet of Muhammad Ali, Viceroy of Egypt, and the Ottoman Sultan's chief supporter against the Greeks at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. Only Russia, however, declared war to Turkey. Defeated Turkey accepted the Treaty of Adrianople of 1829 and recognized Greek autonomy. In 1832, Greece that won the European powers' recognition of its independence. Europe chose a Bavarian prince as king of the Greek state. Otto I proved authoritarian and unpopular. However, under pressure, the constitution promulgated in 1844, but was forced to abdicate in 1862. Otto I was succeeded by a Danish prince who, as George I, who reigned from 1863 to 1913, introduced a new constitution in 1864, establishing a unicameral parliament. Great Britain ceded the Ionian Islands, and in 1881, Greece acquired Thelsi and part of Epirus. Due to British opposition, Greece was unable to annex Crete during the Great Uprising from 1866 to 1869 against the Ottoman rule. The continuous irredentist agitation to absorb Crete led to the Greek-Turkish War of 1897, during which Greece was defeated. But after strong pressure from the European Central Powers, Crete was finally declared independent and later, in 1913, attached to Greece. In the Balkan Wars from 1912 to 1913, Greece obtained the southeastern Macedonia and western Thrace, the border with Albania. The newly independent gave a larger part of Epirus to Greece, but neither country was satisfied, and the area remained under discussion until 1971, when Greece, at least temporarily, dropped its claims on the northern Epirus. George I was assassinated in 1913 and was succeeded by Constantine I. In World War I, Venizelos, who favored the Allies, negotiated in 1915 an agreement that allowed the Allies to land troops at Salonika. However, King Constantine, who favored neutrality, refused to help the Allies, and Venizelos was dismissed as prime minister. He also organized then in 1916 a government in Thessaloniki, while a year later in 1917 pressure from the Allies led to the abdication of Constantine in favor of the younger son, Alexander. Venizelos again became premier, and Greece fully entered the war. At the peace conference, the Treaty of Neuilly, Greece obtained the rule of the Bulgarian coast of the Aegean Sea and some remnants of European Turkey, including the eastern Thrace and the Dodecanese, except for Rhodes. But excluding the area of the Strait, Izmir was placed under Greek administration pending a plebiscite. Encouraged by the Allies, the Greeks invaded Asia Minor, but were defeated in 1922 by Turkish forces. The Treaty of Lausanne identified the Maritsa River as the border Turkish-Greek in Europe. A separate agreement established compulsory exchange of populations, for it's about 1.5 million Greeks of Asia Minor were resettled in Greece. About 800,000 Turks and 80,000 Bulgarians left Greece to be repatriated to their countries. Constantine, who had returned after the death of King Alexander, was again deposed in 1922. George II succeeded Alexander, but soon he was also deposed in 23, and the Republic was proclaimed in 24, later confirmed by a plebiscite. The years of 1924 to 35 were marked by unstable economic conditions and by violent political strife, including coups. The defeat in 1935 of the rebel Venizel in Crete marked the end of the Republic. And then eventually, through a lot of people organizing plebiscites and more coups, led to the restoration of the monarchy and the return of George II. In 1936, Premier John Metaxas, supported by the king, established a dictatorship, ostensibly to avoid the communist takeover of the country. In foreign policy, Greece abandoned the anti-Turkish policy by establishing, in 1934, the Balkan Entente with Yugoslavia, Romania, and Turkey. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Greece remained neutral. In October 1940, however, Italy, after an ultimatum farce, invaded Greece through Italian Albania. The Greeks resisted successfully, carrying the war in southern Albania. When Germany began to gather its troops on the border, mainland Greece at the end of April, and fell into German hands during the month of May followed Crete. So Greece was absolutely smoking Italy, but then the Germans came. The Greek government fled to Cairo, then in Great Britain, and in 1943 he settled back to Cairo. The German occupation, in which Bulgarian and Italian troops took part, plunged Greece into abject poverty with serious food shortages. The resistance began to grow despite ruthless reprisals, and puppet governments soon destined to failure. Bands of guerrillas controlled large rural areas. In 1943, sporadic civil war began between the communist guerrilla group and the monarchist group. The fighters soon began to control much of Greece. After the Germans began to retreat in September of 1944, British troops landed, and by November, all Germans were expelled from the country. The appalling financial and economic conditions faced by the government on its return to Athens were complicated by an explosive political situation. In December of 1944, fighting broke out in Athens between British troops and the communist guerrilla group, which ignored the British order to disarm. With the intervention of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was established a temporary but precarious truce was arranged in February of 1945. In September of 1946, a referendum decided in favor of the return of George II, reigning monarch. George died in 1947 and was succeeded by his brother Paul. Also in 1946 was renewed, and the guerrilla bands led by the communists were successful in the mountainous districts of the north, with the accusations by the Greek government, backed by Britain and the United States, that Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria would help the communist rebels were born very controversial at the United Nations between the Western and Soviet bloc. With the continuing civil war, Britain was no longer able to extend the government financially and militarily. Thus, U.S. President Harry S. Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, with which the United States sent a group of military officers to train and advise the Greek army, allocating finally about $400 million in military and economic aid. In December 1947, the communists proclaimed a rival government in the country. However, at the end of 1949, the rebels, having suffered severe military setbacks and no longer able to receive aid from Yugoslavia, which had defected from the Soviet bloc in 1948, seized open hostilities. The Civil War was marked by brutality on both sides. Economic conditions were miserable, and accusations of incompetence and corruption were brought against the Greek government, both from the communists. Political freedom was reduced, and the Communist Party was outlawed. The legislator, member of the Populist Party, ran the country under the Constitution of 1911 and was authorized to be revised. During the years of 1950 and 1941, the Greek government proved highly unstable until the ratification of the new constitution and elections of 1952, with which Marshal Papagos became prime minister with a large majority. Greece thus became a founding member of the United Nations, and in 1951 was admitted to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. On the death of the prime minister in 1955, Konstantin Karamanlis succeeded the National Radical Union, whose party increased the majority in subsequent elections until 1961. Under Papagos and Karamanlis, the Greek economy improved considerably, despite a series of disastrous earthquakes in 53 to 54 that saw the United States still provide significant economic and military aid to Greece. In 1954, Greece signed an alliance with Turkey and Yugoslavia, but friction with Greece and also with the United Kingdom soon re-proposed for the issue of sovereignty of Cyprus, whose majority population is ethnically Greek, and continued even after the independence of Cyprus in 1960. In the 1963 elections, despite his party had won the vast majority of the votes in Parliament, George Papandreou failed to get the vote of confidence for his government, and new elections were held in 1964. This time, the Centre Union gained a majority of seats, and Papandreou became prime minister. Also in 64, Paul died, and was succeeded by his son Constantine II. Remember Paul from earlier? That one time I mentioned him? In mid of 1965, General George Grievous accused the current prime minister's son to facilitate a secret group of army officers led by the left. Similar charges were brought against both the prime minister, also by the minister of defense. In the uproar that ensued, Constantine forced the resignation of George Papandreou, who had long been an opponent of the monarchy. After a period of uncertainty, in September of 1965, a new government was formed. This government fell in December of 65, and Constantine authorized a new extra parliamentary government pending elections set for May of 1967. And there's a reason why I didn't say the person's name, because I cannot pronounce that. That said, leader gained the support of George Papandreou and others, the leader of the Radical National Union, in fact, but was forced to resign in March of 1967 and was replaced as prime minister soon after. Before the election should occur, some army officers staged an April 21st of 1967 coup, planning an imminent communist establishment in Greece, which didn't really work, but that lasted until 1974. During the regime of colonels, many liberal and leftist politicians were placed under arrest, and strict controls were established on the life of the Greeks. After a failed coup against Constantine II went into exile, shortly thereafter, the new prime minister and the deputy prime minister are a few people who resignated from the army. Some clandestine opposition groups were organized in Greece, and a large international protest against the dictatorial ways of the new regime took hold. In 1968, a new constitution that reduced dramatically expanding the power of the monarchy to the prime minister was overwhelmingly approved in the referendum. The controls on the life of the Greeks were the lightest, and most political prisoners were freed in early 1970. In 1972, Papadopoulos, definitely botched that name, but it's Greek names, by then the most powerful person in the country, also assumed the post of regent. In May of 1973, members of the Navy staged a coup but failed. In June of 1973, the monarchy fell and Greece became a presidential republic. After this move was also approved by popular referendum, the leader that I just tried to pronounce her not long ago became provisional president, and someone else replaced him as prime minister. In an attempt to remove traces of military rule and therefore to obtain a greater international consensus, the new order in Greece for new elections planned for 1974. However, November 25th of 1973, the president was ousted in a military coup by someone who then became president. Due to Gizikis, which is the person that led the military groups, government instability to gain control of Cyprus in 74 voluntarily was handed over power to a civilian government, headed by Karamanlis, who returned from exile. Most exiled politicians back in Greece, all political parties, including the Communist Party, was allowed to operate freely, and the 1951 constitution was reinstated. In a 1974 referendum, Greek voters voted against the establishment of the new monarchy and expressed themselves in favor of parliamentary presidential republic. Karamanlis and the new Democratic Party were re-elected and retained the majority in 1977. In 1980, he was elected president for a term of 5 years. In 1971, Greece became a member of the European Community, now the EU. The Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement under Papandreou joined a majority in the elections of 1981 and 84, putting an end to 35 years of pro-Western government and the conservative state. Under the socialist governments of the year of 1980, support for the public sector grew, and many state enterprises continued to lose money. The PASOK failed to retain power in 1989, but 3 elections were needed before the conservative New Democracy Party in 1990 asserted a new parliamentary majority of 1 vote. Konstantin Mitsotakis then became premier, and Karamanlis was elected president for the second time. Faced with the record deficits and high inflation, the Mitsotakis government instituted a severe austerity program and started large-scale privatization of state industries. In the 1993 elections, PASOK regained the power with Papandreou as premier, and privatization programs were reduced. A dispute with Yugoslav Macedonia was resolved in 1995 when the new republic agreed to change its flag and renounce any territorial claims against Greece. But the use of the name Macedonia by the neighboring country has continued to be a source of discussions in Greece. Karamanlis retired as president in 1995 and was succeeded by Kostas, who was re-elected in 2000. In January of 1996, Papandreou, who was then seriously ill, resigned and was replaced by the moderate socialist Kostas Simitis, who continued a series of economic reforms aimed at preparing the nation to join the European Union's single currency, the euro, which was adopted by Greece in 2001. That was a lot of history since World War II, a lot of coups, a lot of instability, a lot of different presidents and prime ministers, a lot of communists or no communists. So that entire section was probably pretty hard to understand. But that will sum up the history part of Greece, since the 2000s and 2010s is almost the same thing, except there's also the economic crisis in 2008, which I would talk about, but that in itself would maybe double the length of this video. Anyways, on to the fun fact. The first fun fact is that more tourists visit Greece every year than there are people living in Greece, by up to 3 times. The next one is that the first ever Olympic Games were held in Greece. The third is that Athens is the oldest capital in Europe. The fourth is that there is not a single spot in the Greek nation that is more than 137 kilometers from the ocean. And the last one is that Greece is over 80% mountainous, being one of the most mountainous countries in the entire continent, and maybe even the world. That was a lot. That was a very history-filled video. Probably could have cut out a lot of the 50s through 2000, but now that Greece is over with, my next history video. Now that Greece is over with, stay tuned to my next simplified history video, and it will be shorter than this one. That is a fact.